We're often told that the newest, latest, greatest sensors are clearly the best. But are they? Over the last 12-14 years, I've been lucky enough to own Fujifilm cameras with all the X-Trans sensors, 1 through 5. And I'm not entirely sure that the latest was the best. Today, I'm going to carry out an entirely unscientific and subjective test of files from each of those Fujifilm generations. Let's get into it. Since the dawn of digital photography, there have been pixel peepers, those people that will delve really deeply into the quality of an image, into the absolute clarity of a pixel on that image. But of course, in the real world, that doesn't count for anything. What actually counts is the image itself, the overall image, whether that's seen on screen or whether that's printed up to 20 by 30 inches. The most important thing for us is how it looks. So, as I mentioned, I've actually owned all 5 X-Trans sensors. It started with the X-Trans 1 on my X Pro 1. I then progressed to the X100S, which had the X-Trans 2 sensor. Then the XT2, which had the X-Trans 3 sensor, the step up to 24 megapixel. The XT4 with its X-Trans 4 26 megapixel sensor. And finally, the last Fuji that I owned until now was the XH2 with its X-Trans 5 sensor at 40 megapixels. I say until now because if you've watched my recent video, you'll know that I've just bought myself a second-hand XE3 with a 23mm lens. And that might give you a clue to my conclusions on this video. So as I said, this is an entirely subjective and entirely unscientific test that I'm going to do today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop each of those files into DxO PhotoLab 9. And there's a reason I'm using DxO PhotoLab 9, and it's the worms. Adobe Lightroom still suffers from the worms in Fuji files. Now, they can be negated to a certain extent by using enhanced details, but there's no way of batch processing those images. So if you're looking to get the absolute finest detail out of your Fujifilm files, you need to step away from Lightroom. DxO does an absolutely fantastic job of processing Fujifilm files without worms and artifacts that you tend to get in Lightroom. So before we get into it, I just want to digress a little bit. A couple of years ago, I did a couple of films about discovering my late father's Minolta X300 and the journey it took me on in discovering that not only my father had a passion for photography, but also there was a story to his life that I had never found out about. And putting film through that camera for the first time led me on a journey of discovery about my father's life. And that leads us in really nicely to today. As you might be aware, today is Father's Day, and DxO have a fantastic Father's Day promotion where new customers can get 20% off any purchase of DxO products. I'm going to leave a link to that code and their website in the description below. Now, this is a limited time offer for Father's Day and a few days around it, so make sure you get in nice and early, get your copy of DxO PhotoLab or Nik plugins or whatever DxO product you fancy, using that code down below. So, as I say, I'm using DxO PhotoLab for this test. It's entirely unscientific. We're going to jump into PhotoLab and have a look at 5 generations of X-Trans sensor. So here we have the 5 images from the 5 different X-Trans sensors in DxO PhotoLab. I'm in the photo library module of DxO PhotoLab, which is really useful. You can view a large image like this, or you can slide up and see the whole folder. Obviously, I've only got 5 images in this particular folder, so that's not particularly relevant. However, what we're going to do is have a look at all of these images individually and just do some basic adjustments. We're going to start with the original X-Trans sensor in the form of the X Pro 1, and that's this image here. Then we'll move on to X-Trans 2 through the X100S, and then we'll have a look at the X-Trans 3, and this one was shot on the XT2. Then we'll look at the X-Trans 4, which is the XT4, and finally we'll look at the X-Trans 5, which was the 40 megapixel version in the XH2. All of the images are relatively high dynamic range images, and we're just going to play around with them in PhotoLab just to see what we can get out of them. It's nothing scientific, it's just a quick look at 5 generations of Fuji sensor and seeing how they've progressed, or whether there was a sweet spot, or just simply how easy they are to edit. So let's start with the X Pro one and the first original X-Trans sensor. And here we are in the customize module now, and we've got all our information over here. So we're just going to go over to the exposure tab. A little bit bright on this image. Everything seems to be in the histogram, as you can see over here. And we're just going to slide this back a little bit, bring a little bit more definition into it. And we'll bring the blacks down a touch, darken those shadows up a little bit. Bring the shadow areas up and the mid-tone areas down a little bit, and that looks good. So if we come over to the color module, I want this to have a little bit more of a sunrise look to it, because it is very much a sunrise shot. So we'll just increase the color temperature a little bit like that, and that looks really, really nice. What I'd like to do also, I think we'll just go back a little bit and we'll see if we can bring a little bit more definition into these leaves up here, and we'll do that by using the midtones again. We'll bring those up a little bit. Nope, okay, the midtones aren't going to do it, so maybe the shadows will do it a little bit more. Not really. So what we'll do is we'll use the tone curve and see if we can just bring them up a little bit in that. And yes, we can. And if we just bring the other end down around about here to give us a subtle S-curve, just to restore those sort of brighter areas of the image. And that's a really nice subtle looking image. I don't want to over contrast it, because it is a sort of subtle soft light style of image. And that looks really good. Let's zoom in a little bit. Obviously this was a 16 megapixel sensor, so at 100% it's not massively zoomed, but as you can see it's very, very sharp. The lens I had on this particular camera was, let's have a little look, the 60mm macro, a lens that I didn't particularly get on with. I think it was a 40 lens in the first place, so it didn't focus well, and the aperture ring didn't always open up to the full wide aperture. But as you can see, overall the image has got a lovely, lovely soft feel to it. Let's come in at 200%, see if we've got any grain. There shouldn't be, it's at the lowest ISO. And yeah, that's a really, really nice looking image. For a 16 megapixel sensor that is, what, 12, 14 years old now? That's a really, really lovely looking image. So let's come over to the next one, and that's the X100S, and this was the X-Trans 2 sensor. Let's just bring that back to full screen like that. Not quite as wide a dynamic range in this. We'll just try and boost this image up a little bit to make it a little better. As you can see, we might be clipping slightly on the right of the histogram there, so I think we'll bring the overall exposure down a tad, just to bring it in. And as you can see, those highlights are coming in. They're still a little bit blown perhaps. If we put the clipping tags on, no, they don't seem to be clipping at all. If we rose those highlights, we should see the clipping. Yeah, no, so that's absolutely fine. We'll leave those on for the moment. And we'll bring the shadows up a little bit, bring a little bit more information into the Houses of Parliament. And we'll bring the blacks down just to give us a little bit more contrast. Bring the highlights down to give us a bit more of that sky. And I think we'll just warm it up. We'll go over to the color controls again, just warm it up a little bit, give it that sort of evening look that it should have. And let's zoom in and have a little look at 100%. Again, I think the X-Trans 2 was a 16 megapixel sensor. So we're not zooming in particularly far on this image, but again, it looks really, really sharp and really, really well defined. If we come in at 200%, you can see it starts to break up a little bit. That's just purely because we're at 200%, not 100%. But in terms of sharpness, obviously this was a fixed 23mm lens on the X100S, so the sharpness is pretty good, but just the definition and feel of the image is really, really nice. There's lovely subtlety in the sky there. As I said, these highlights are not at all blown out. We can blow them if we want to, but these are well within the tolerance of the sensor. And yeah, that's a really, really nice image. Obviously, we can do a little bit of work in post-production on the geometry and straighten up the towers and stuff like that. It can be quite difficult with a wide-angled lens that you're tilting up a little bit just to get the verticals upright. They can converge a little bit. But overall, again, X-Trans 2, a very, very nice sensor. So let's come to X-Trans 3 in the form of the XT2. This image is going to be a little bit more of a challenge because, as you can see, we do have some highlights blown out. So I think the first thing we'll do is we come back over to the Basics tab and we'll bring the exposure down, come down around about there. I'm not going to come too far down because you're never going to get the highlights back in that sun there. We might be able to get some of these highlights in the sky there sorted out. So first of all, let's just bring the shadows up and get some more definition into the buildings here. And as you can see, that's worked really, really well. There's actually plenty of dynamic range in this sensor. If we bring the highlights down, yeah, we're actually bringing out those highlights. We're reducing that clipping really, really nicely. And if we bring the black down just a touch to give us a little bit more contrast. Again, I can sort the geometry of this image out in PhotoLab, but this is not about geometry. And let's just come to the color tab again. I think we'll warm this image up a touch, give it that sort of sunset feel to it, possibly a tad green. So we'll add a little bit of magenta tint to that, tiny, tiny amount. And as we zoom in, this is the first sensor where we stepped up to 24 megapixels. So as you can see, we've zoomed in a little bit more. But again, some lovely, lovely sort of subtlety to the image. Obviously it's blown out here. You've got the ultra bright sun just peeking out from the side of the cathedral here. That's going to challenge any sensor. But if you look at it, technically it's a backlit shot. We've managed to raise the shadows up. We've got loads of definition. We can see very clearly the people sitting on these seats here. You can see how sharp it is as well. And I think this was the 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens, which was a very, very good lens. If we come into 200%, and again, it's a really, really nice sensor. There's a real sort of subtlety to it. So again, another lovely, and this was my favorite X-Trans sensor, and that's the reason I went back to Fuji in the form of that old XE3 that I've talked about recently. If you've seen the video, it's not a return to Fuji per se, but it was a return to Fuji for the fun factor, the love of shooting. The Sony is so much more capable, but that little Fuji XE3 with a 23mm lens on it is just such a fun combination. But again, X-Trans 3 sensor, absolutely lovely, sharp, really, really nice image. So let's come over to X-Trans 4 in the form of the XT4, and we'll just zoom out again. Obviously quite a high dynamic range image again, very blown out highlights here. So we'll go back to the basic exposure tab and just bring those exposures down. And it's coming. We'll leave it there and we'll pull the rest down in highlights. We'll bring the shadows up, probably as far as I'd want to go. If we go too far, it looks very washed out. We can probably counter that with a little bit of black like that, and maybe just bring the shadows up a tad more. And now we'll bring the highlights down, see if we can get a little bit more definition in that sun. And yes, we can pull those highlights. We've had to pull the highlights all the way down to -100, but remarkably, we've actually managed to get those highlights back from the original image, which was very, very blown out. Now, I would say it looks a little bit underexposed. We'll bring the blacks down to give us a little bit more contrast. And we'll try and bring those shadows up a little bit more. And perhaps we'll bring the exposure up a touch as well. And we'll just add a little bit of yellow to the temperature, a touch of magenta just to take that edge off of the yellow. And considering how high dynamic range this image was, we've managed to pull it back. If we zoom in, this was the X-Trans 4, which I think was a 26 megapixel sensor. Obviously, we've got a lot of lens flare here. I think, again, I was on the 18 to 55 millimeter. It looks very, very sharp, and it's maintained a very, very sort of good contrast across the whole of the image here. You've got some definition in the trees over here, and we still managed to pull back. It's not the greatest looking image, but I think with a little bit more work in DxO PhotoLab, I could make this a really good image. Is it as good as the X-Trans 3 though? This is the question. I think it's not quite as subtle. It's got a more digital film look. If we come back to this image here, it's very, very subjective, obviously, but I feel that this has a more subtle look to it, a less digital look to it than the X-Trans 4, the next generation of sensor, particularly if you look in the sharpness of the image. If we come up here, there's a kind of digital sharpness to this image that I don't think the X-Trans 3 sensor has. But again, that's very, very subjective, and you might think absolutely different. Let me know in the comments below if you prefer the X-Trans 3 or the X-Trans 4 sensor. So finally, we're coming to the X-Trans 5. And this is the sensor I really didn't like. It's the 40 megapixel sensor X-Trans 5, and I just felt it was too digital. I felt that it was quite difficult to manipulate the files. It would get noisy very quickly no matter what you did with it. As you can see, it's relatively high contrast. We've got blown out highlights over here on the right. So we'll go back to the exposure tab and bring the exposure down a touch. Those highlights come in very, very quickly there. We won't go all the way with those. We'll bring the shadows up a little bit, bring some definition to the beach and the rock there. Now we'll pull the highlights down to get some definition in that sky. And that looks pretty good. Now we'll bring the contrast down a touch by reducing the blacks and perhaps just bringing the shadow areas up a touch more. And let's play with the midtones. You'll notice that I'm not using any micro contrast, you know, the equivalent of clarity and stuff like that, or any of DxO's smart lighting, clear view tools. I just want to purely look at the absolute basic tools on the absolute basic sensor image, raw image. It just doesn't look as good to me. Now, obviously, it's a very, very different subject, so with different lighting and stuff, and the shadow and the dynamic range is pulled up nicely, but it just doesn't feel as nice. The colours, they're there, but they don't look as filmic as the X-Trans 2 and the X-Trans 3 sensors. It's certainly sharp, but it just never did it for me. I'm going to be honest that the X-Trans 5 sensor never did it for me. And it was that sensor, plus I felt the build quality of the Fujis had decreased over the years to the point where a shutter button failed on my XH2. The combination of those two really put me off of Fuji and pushed me over to Sony. However, going back to the X-Trans 3 sensor that the X-T2 and the XH3 and the XE3 that I now have, I absolutely love those sensors, and I felt the build quality was much, much better, and I really enjoyed using the cameras. And I think that's actually the key here. I enjoyed using the X100S, I enjoyed using the X-T2. I didn't enjoy the X-T4 quite as much, mainly because I felt the build quality had started to decrease at that point. And as I mentioned, the XH2 was the final straw for me with Fuji. The X Pro one was a brilliant camera that I never really got on with. At the time, I was suffering from cataracts in my eyes, and I found the viewfinder to be really, really hard to work with. Perhaps that's worth revisiting now. You know, I've had the surgery and my eyes are significantly better. So maybe I'll revisit an X Pro one. You can pick them up quite cheaply, and obviously I do have a 23mm lens from my XE3, so that might be something in the future. I hope you've enjoyed that little test. It's not scientific, it's entirely subjective, as I said. I still think, my personal opinion is that the X-Trans 3 sensor was peak Fuji. X-Trans 4 started to introduce a little bit of sort of clinical digital look to its images, and by X-Trans 5 at 40 megapixels I felt that there was noise creeping into the images at relatively low ISOs, and that pixel density made it quite hard to edit without introducing banding and noise to the images. For me, peak Fuji was X-Trans 3, and that's why I bought myself an XE3 camera not so long ago. And do have a look at that video. I've left a link in the description before. So don't forget, Father's Day today, limited time to get a 20% discount on DxO products. And let me know, what was your favourite Fuji sensor of all time? Are you firmly in the modern X-Trans 4, X-Trans 5 camp and feel that they are really, really good sensors? Or do you prefer to step back to some of those older X-Trans sensors, perhaps perhaps even the original X-Trans 1, which even despite its age and 16 megapixels put out a really beautiful image. Let me know about that in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, a like would be fantastic, a subscription would be even better. And I really look forward to seeing you in the next one.